It didn't begin with a scandal, it began with numbers. Cold, clinical, impossible-to-ignore numbers buried deep inside a royal audit that was never meant to see daylight. But when Princess Anne stepped into that sealed review chamber, something shifted. The figures didn't add up. And what they revealed would ignite one of the most explosive internal reckonings the monarchy had faced in decades. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made this moment so unsettling was not just the existence of discrepancies, but the quiet insistence from certain corners of the institution that those discrepancies be ignored. Reports suggest the audit itself had been routine at first, one of many internal reviews conducted to ensure that legacy funds, particularly those connected to the next generation, remained intact and properly allocated. But as the numbers were cross-checked, as ledgers were revisited and authorizations examined, a pattern began to emerge. It was subtle at first, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But to those familiar with the intricate financial architecture of the monarchy, it raised immediate concern. Various interpretations of those early findings describe a growing tension among palace accountants. A sense that something was off but difficult to articulate without stepping beyond their defined roles. Insiders whisper that the phrase irregular movement of funds began circulating quietly, never written down, never formally acknowledged, but repeated just enough to signal unease. And at the center of that unease was a series of allocations tied to Zara Tyndall funds that, by all accounts, were meant to remain untouched. Preserved as part of a long-standing financial structure designed to support her position outside the formal royal payroll. Those familiar with the duchy's internal systems suggest that such funds are treated with a level of care bordering on reverence, their purpose clearly defined, their movement tightly controlled, which is why the discovery of even minor discrepancies was enough to trigger concern. But this was not minor. This was consistent, repeated, and increasingly difficult to explain away. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of palace administration that when Anne reviewed the initial summary, she did not react with shock, but with a kind of cold, focused resolve. She reportedly requested full access to the audit, overriding attempts to limit its scope, insisting that every transaction be traced, every authorization verified. That decision, according to sources close to the process, marked the turning point. Because once the audit expanded, once the protective boundaries around it were removed, the pattern became undeniable. Numbers that should have remained static had shifted. Allocations that should have been preserved had been rerouted, and approvals that should have followed a clear chain of command appeared to have bypassed it entirely. Different interpretations of this moment describe a quiet but unmistakable shift in atmosphere within the palace, conversations becoming shorter, emails more guarded, access more restricted. Because by then, it was no longer just about accounting. It was about accountability. And the question that hung over every subsequent discussion was no longer whether something had gone wrong, but who had allowed it to happen. But what began as a financial irregularity would soon unravel into something far more personal and far more dangerous. The money wasn't ordinary. It was legacy money, quietly preserved, carefully allocated, and deeply tied to the future of one name, Zara. But somewhere along the line, that safeguard fractured. What should have remained untouched began shifting through channels no one expected. And when the trail was finally followed, it led somewhere no one inside the palace was prepared to confront. What made these funds so sensitive was not just their value, but their meaning. They were never designed as simple financial support. They were part of a carefully maintained structure that reflected both tradition and quiet responsibility. Those familiar with the inner workings of royal financial frameworks suggest that allocations connected to Zara Tyndall were treated as extensions of a long-standing understanding and unspoken agreement that certain members of the family, though not bound by official duties, would still be protected by the institution they represented. It was, in many ways, a balance between independence and legacy, between modern identity and inherited obligation. But that balance depends entirely on trust, and once that trust is questioned, everything begins to shift. Reports suggest that as auditors dug deeper into the accounts flagged during the initial review, they encountered a pattern that was anything but straightforward. Transactions appeared to move through layers of administrative routing, passing through accounts and approvals that seemed legitimate on the surface, but increasingly complex upon closer inspection. It wasn't a single transfer that raised alarm, it was the repetition, the quiet consistency of movement that did not align with the original intent of the funds. Various interpretations of these findings describe a growing frustration among those tasked with making sense of the data, as if the system itself had been designed to obscure rather than clarify. Insiders whisper that what began as a question of accounting soon became a question of design. Was this confusion accidental, or had it been constructed deliberately? Because the deeper they looked, the harder it became to follow a clean, transparent line from source to destination. And in an institution where financial clarity is not just expected but enforced, that lack of clarity carried serious implications. Those familiar with palace administrative protocols note that even minor deviations are typically documented, justified, and corrected swiftly. But here, the deviations seem to persist, quietly embedded within a system that no one had fully questioned until now. Early suspicions leaned toward administrative reallocation as an explanation that, while concerning, still fell within the realm of procedural error. But as more records were examined, that explanation began to lose weight, because these movements were not random, they followed a pattern. And patterns, especially within the rigid structures of royal finance, rarely exist without intention. It is now whispered in the highest circles of palace staff that the atmosphere surrounding the audit began to change during this phase. Conversations grew more guarded. Access to certain documents became more restricted, and the simple act of asking questions started to carry an unspoken risk. Because by this point, the issue was no longer just about where the money had gone, it was about why it had been moved in the first place. And perhaps more importantly, who had the authority to make those decisions. As investigators continued to trace each transaction, mapping out the intricate web of approvals and transfers, the complexity began to collapse into something far more focused. The confusion that once clouded the audit started to clear, revealing a smaller circle of influence than anyone had initially expected. And with that clarity came a growing sense of inevitability. Because when patterns converge, when routes align, and when approvals begin to point in the same direction, the question is no longer whether someone is responsible, but how far that responsibility reaches. And as investigators traced every transaction, one name began surfacing more than any other. At first, they refused to believe it. Even when the patterns aligned, even when the approvals matched, there was hesitation because the name attached carried weight, influence, and undeniable proximity to power. But evidence doesn't bend to reputation, and as the audit deepened, the reality became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a clerical error. It was something deliberate. What unsettled those reviewing the documents was not just the presence of approvals, but the consistency behind them. Each authorization followed protocol just enough to appear legitimate, yet together they formed a chain that raised uncomfortable questions. Reports suggest that as auditors cross-referenced signatures, timestamps, and internal routing paths, they began to notice that a specific channel of authority appeared repeatedly subtle at first, but impossible to dismiss once fully mapped. And that channel, according to various interpretations, pointed toward the administrative orbit of Queen Camilla. This was the moment where quiet concern turned into silent shock. Because within the structure of the monarchy, authorization is not merely procedural, it reflects trust, hierarchy, and carefully maintained boundaries. Those familiar with palace financial systems suggest that approvals connected to senior figures carry a level of weight that discourages scrutiny, not because they are above question, but because questioning them carries consequences. And yet, here was a pattern that seemed to demand exactly that. Insiders whisper that early discussions among auditors were marked by hesitation, as if acknowledging the connection out loud would make it more real, more dangerous. Some reportedly argued for caution, suggesting that the pattern might still be explained by delegated authority or administrative overlap. Others, however, insisted that the alignment was too precise, too consistent to be accidental. As documentation continued to surface, the divide within the palace grew sharper. On one side were those who believed the institution itself needed protection from the fallout of such a revelation, urging restraint, careful wording, and controlled interpretation. On the other hand, those who argued that the institution could only survive through accountability, that ignoring the evidence would cause far greater damage in the long run. It is now whispered in the highest administrative circles that this internal tension created a kind of silent standoff where conversations became less about facts and more about consequences. Because by this point, the issue had evolved beyond numbers and authorizations. It had become a question of intent. And intent, unlike error, carries weight that cannot easily be contained. Meanwhile, Princess Anne reportedly showed no sign of retreat. Various interpretations of her response describe a steady escalation, not in emotion, but in scope. Where others hesitated, she expanded the audit, requesting additional records, deeper access, broader oversight. Each new layer of investigation seemed to bring the pattern into sharper focus, reducing ambiguity and increasing pressure. Those close to the process suggest that this phase marked a turning point, where the possibility of coincidence was gradually replaced by the likelihood of deliberate action. And with that shift came a growing sense of urgency, because if the movements were intentional, then they were not just a breach of protocol, but a challenge to the very structure that governs royal accountability. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere reportedly became increasingly strained. Access to information tightened, conversations were held in smaller circles, and the usual flow of communication slowed to a near standstill. Insiders claimed that even routine interactions carried an undercurrent of tension, as if everyone understood that something significant was unfolding, but no one could openly acknowledge it. The audit, once a technical process, had transformed into something far more volatile, a test of loyalty, authority, and the limits of internal scrutiny. And, as more documents were examined, more approvals traced, and more connections uncovered, the question that lingered was no longer whether the pattern existed, but how it would be interpreted when fully exposed. Because uncovering a connection is one thing. Proving that it was intentional, that it was designed, that it served a purpose, that is something else entirely. But uncovering the connection was only the beginning. Proving intent would ignite an entirely new battle. Princess Anne didn't react with emotion, she reacted with precision. Where others hesitated, she moved, quietly, strategically, ruthlessly. Within hours of confirming the discrepancies, a rarely invoked internal mechanism was set into motion, one designed not for scandal management, but for containment, accountability, and control. What followed was not chaos, but calculation. Reports suggest that Princess Anne initiated what insiders have come to describe as the audit lock, a protocol rarely spoken about and even more rarely used, reserved for moments when internal integrity itself is believed to be at risk. It was not announced, it was not explained, but its effects were immediate. Access points that had once flowed freely became restricted. Financial channels that had operated without interruption were suddenly paused, reviewed, and in some cases, quietly frozen. Those familiar with palace administrative structures suggest that such a move is never taken lightly, as it signals not just concern, but a loss of confidence in existing oversight. And yet, Anne did not stop there. Various interpretations of her next steps describe a deliberate widening of the investigative circle, bringing in independent auditors whose presence alone signaled that the matter had moved beyond internal discretion. This was no longer about resolving a discrepancy quietly. It was about verifying every detail under scrutiny that could withstand external examination. Insiders whisper that the introduction of outside oversight created an immediate shift in tone, replacing uncertainty with something far more structured, far more controlled. Because external auditors do not operate on deference. They operate on evidence. And evidence, once exposed, has a way of reshaping everything around it. At the same time, the internal dynamics of the palace began to change in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Key figures who might typically have been involved in discussions were reportedly excluded from the decision-making loop. Their access limited, their influence reduced. Those familiar with the situation suggest that this was not an act of punishment, but of containment and effort to ensure that the investigation could proceed without interference, without pressure, without the risk of its findings being diluted or redirected. But even containment has consequences. Because when individuals accustomed to access suddenly find themselves on the outside, questions begin to form. And in an environment already charged with suspicion, those questions can quickly turn into tension. It is now whispered in the highest administrative circles that the atmosphere within the palace shifted almost overnight. What had once been a space of controlled routine became something far more restrained, more deliberate. Conversations were shorter, movements more calculated. Even the flow of information seemed to slow, as if every word carried weight, every detail mattered. The audit, once a process, had become a presence, something that influenced decisions, shaped interactions, and quietly redefined the balance of power within the institution. Because this was no longer just about identifying what had happened. It was about managing what would happen next. Early consequences began to surface, not in public statements or visible actions, but in subtle adjustments that spoke volumes to those paying attention. Financial pathways were rerouted. Authorizations required additional layers of verification, and the once seamless operation of certain administrative functions became deliberately slower, more cautious. Reports suggest that these changes were not temporary, but part of a broader effort to reinforce control, to ensure that no further irregularities could occur while the investigation remained ongoing. And with each adjustment, the message became clearer. This was not a situation that would be quietly resolved and forgotten. This was something that would be examined, understood, and ultimately addressed. But even as control tightened and the investigation advanced, a deeper question began to take shape, one that could not be answered through audits or protocols alone. Because identifying discrepancies is one thing, containing them is another, but confronting the implications of what they reveal that requires something far more difficult. And as the walls began closing in, the palace found itself facing a question it could no longer avoid. There are moments when silence becomes impossible, when the weight of what's been uncovered demands acknowledgement. This was one of those moments. Behind closed doors, with no cameras and no statements, a confrontation unfolded that would redefine alliances, expose fractures, and force truths into the open. Reports suggest the meeting itself was not scheduled in the traditional sense, but rather assembled with urgency, drawing together only those whose presence could not be avoided. At the center of it all was King Charles III, placed in a position that insiders describe as both unavoidable and deeply uncomfortable. Because this was not a ceremonial gathering. This was not about optics or public reassurance. This was about decisions that carried consequences no one could fully predict. Various interpretations of what unfolded behind those closed doors describe an atmosphere thick with restraint, where every word was measured and every silence carried meaning. It is now whispered in the highest circles that the discussion did not begin with accusations, but with questions carefully framed, deliberately paced, yet impossible to ignore. Questions about authorizations, about oversight, about the movement of funds that had already disrupted the internal balance of trust. And as those questions were asked, the tension reportedly began to rise, not because answers were immediately given, but because the implications behind them were understood by everyone present. At one side of this divide stood Princess Anne, unwavering, focused, and according to those familiar with her approach, entirely committed to seeing the process through to its conclusion. Her position, as described by insiders, was not driven by emotion, but by principle, the belief that the integrity of the institution must come before the comfort of its members. On the other side, there were those who reportedly urged caution, emphasizing the importance of preserving unity, of avoiding a rupture that could extend beyond the walls of the palace. Because once such matters move beyond private acknowledgement, they take on a life of their own. And then there was Queen Camilla, whose presence in the conversation, according to various interpretations, shifted the dynamic in ways that could not be ignored. Insiders whisper that the questions directed toward her were not aggressive, but they were direct, focused on clarifying decisions, understanding authorizations, and tracing the reasoning behind actions that had already raised concern. It was, by all accounts, a moment where influence met scrutiny, where proximity to power was no longer enough to shield from inquiry. And while no official account of her responses exists, those familiar with the exchange suggest that the discussion revealed just how complex and how fragile the internal balance had become. For King Charles, the role of mediator was not just difficult, it was defining. Different interpretations of his position describe a man caught between competing obligations, attempting to maintain stability while confronting a situation that demanded resolution. Because this was not a matter that could be deferred or quietly managed. The audit had already moved too far. The evidence had already taken shape, and the presence of multiple perspectives, each grounded in its own version of responsibility, made compromise increasingly difficult. Insiders claimed that this was the moment where the emotional and strategic stakes collided, where decisions were no longer about preference but necessity. Yet, despite the intensity of the discussion, the outcome remained tightly controlled. No statements were issued. No confirmations were made. To the outside world, nothing appeared to have changed. But within the palace, the impact was undeniable. Relationships had shifted. Trust had been tested. And the quiet certainty that once defined internal operations had been replaced by something far more uncertain. Because once questions are asked at that level, they do not simply disappear. They linger, they evolve, and they begin to influence everything that follows. But even as the confrontation ended, its consequences were only just beginning to ripple outward. Through it all, one name remained at the center, not as a player, but as the one most affected. Zara hadn't asked for this. Yet suddenly, her position, her future, and her trust in the system around her were pulled into question. And as the truth emerged, the narrative shifted from power to protection. Reports suggest that as the audit findings began to take clearer shape, one critical clarification surfaced early: Zara Tyndall herself had no direct involvement in the decisions now under scrutiny. And yet, that distinction did little to shield her from the consequences. Because in an institution where perception often travels faster than fact, even indirect association can carry weight. Insiders whisper that her name, once linked quietly to stability and independence, was now being discussed in entirely different terms, shaped not by her actions, but by the circumstances surrounding her. What made the situation more difficult was the contrast between her position and the unfolding reality. Those familiar with her role within the wider royal structure suggest that Zara has long existed at a careful distance from the formal mechanisms of power, close enough to represent legacy, yet removed enough to maintain autonomy. It was a balance that had served her well, allowing her to navigate both public life and private independence without becoming entangled in the complexities that often define senior roles. But this situation disrupted that balance entirely. Because the funds at the center of the audit were not just financial, they were symbolic of that very independence, a safeguard meant to protect rather than expose. And now, that safeguard had become the source of uncertainty. Various interpretations of the internal response describe a growing sense of concern, not just about the implications of the audit, but about the personal impact on Zara herself. It is now whispered in the highest circles that her position, though technically unchanged, began to feel less secure, not in terms of status, but in terms of trust. Because when systems designed to protect are called into question, the individuals they support inevitably feel the ripple effects. And for someone who had maintained a reputation of quiet reliability, that shift carried emotional weight that could not easily be dismissed. At the same time, the role of Princess Anne became more visible, not through public statements, but through quiet alignment. Reports suggest that her continued insistence on transparency was not just about institutional integrity, but about ensuring that the narrative surrounding Zara remained grounded in fact rather than speculation. Insiders claim that Anne's approach during this phase reflected a dual responsibility, protecting the structure while also protecting the individual caught within it. And in doing so, she reinforced a message that would resonate throughout the palace. Accountability and protection are not mutually exclusive. Outside the immediate circle of those directly involved, silence remained the dominant response. No public acknowledgement, no official clarification. Yet beneath that silence, the internal atmosphere continued to shift. Conversations, though limited, reportedly carried a tone of quiet sympathy, an understanding that regardless of where responsibility ultimately lay, Zara had become entangled in a situation she had neither created nor controlled. Those familiar with the dynamics suggest that this quiet recognition began to influence how the situation was perceived, gradually reframing the narrative from one of suspicion to one of unintended consequence. But even as sympathy grew and internal support solidified, the broader implications of the audit continued to expand. Because this was no longer just about one individual or one set of funds. It was about the systems that governed them, the structures that had allowed such movement to occur, and the safeguards that had failed to prevent it. And as those questions gained momentum, It became clear that whatever resolution emerged would not simply restore what had been lost. It would redefine how such matters were handled moving forward. And just when it seemed the storm had reached its peak, the final revelation changed everything. Audits don't deal in emotion, they deal in proof. And when the final report was sealed, signed, and delivered, it didn't just clarify what happened, it confirmed it. What had once been whispers became documented reality. And in that moment, the balance of power inside the palace shifted in a way few had anticipated. Reports suggest that the conclusions reached within that report were not ambiguous, not open to interpretation, but structured with a level of precision that left little room for doubt. Each transaction had been traced, each authorization cross-referenced, each deviation from protocol clearly identified. And while the language of the document remained measured, almost restrained, the implications carried a weight that could not be softened. Because once something is written, once it is formally acknowledged, it becomes part of the institution's internal truth, something that cannot simply be ignored or reinterpreted. Various interpretations of the findings indicate that the audit did, in fact, validate the concerns that had first emerged as quiet suspicions. Financial movements once dismissed as irregularities were now categorized with far greater clarity, their purpose questioned, their execution scrutinized. Insiders whisper that the term misallocation began circulating in reference to the findings, a word that, while technical in nature, carried significant implications within the structured environment of royal financial governance. Because misallocation is not just an error, it is a disruption of intent, a divergence from the principles that govern how resources are managed and preserved. And in an institution where those principles are closely tied to legacy, even a single disruption can ripple outward in ways that are difficult to contain. It is now whispered in the highest administrative circles that the acknowledgement of this breach, whether described as procedural failure or something more deliberate, marked a turning point. Because acknowledgement brings with it responsibility, and responsibility, once accepted, demands response. Those familiar with the situation suggest that this was the moment when the internal narrative shifted from investigation to action, from questioning to decision-making. The focus was no longer on uncovering what had happened, but on determining how the institution would respond to it. And in that shift, certain roles became more clearly defined. At the center of that clarity stood Princess Anne, whose position, according to various interpretations, was significantly strengthened by the outcome. Her insistence on expanding the audit, on maintaining its integrity despite resistance, now appeared not just justified, but necessary. Insiders claim that her approach during the investigation began to be viewed less as a challenge to the system, and more as a reinforcement of it, a demonstration that accountability, even when uncomfortable, is essential to maintaining trust. And in an environment where trust had been quietly eroded, that demonstration carried considerable weight. Meanwhile, the broader institutional response began to take shape, not through dramatic announcements, but through calculated adjustments. Financial oversight mechanisms were reportedly reviewed and, in some cases, restructured. Approval processes became more layered, more deliberate, reflecting a renewed emphasis on transparency and control. Those familiar with the administrative response suggest that these changes were designed not only to address the specific issue uncovered by the audit, but to prevent similar situations from emerging in the future. Because once a weakness is exposed, it must be reinforced. Otherwise, it becomes a vulnerability that can be exploited again. As these adjustments unfolded, the narrative surrounding the situation continued to evolve. What had once been framed as a possibility, a question of whether something had gone wrong, was now understood as a confirmed event, documented and acknowledged within the highest levels of the institution. And with that confirmation came a shift in perception, both internally and among those quietly observing from the outside. Because suspicion can be dismissed. It can be debated, reframed, even ignored. But confirmation carries a different kind of permanence. It defines the past in a way that cannot easily be undone. Yet even as accountability took shape and responses were set into motion, there was a sense that something deeper had been affected. Because this was not just about correcting an error or addressing a breach. It was about restoring a system of trust that had been quietly compromised. And while the audit had provided answers, it had also revealed just how fragile that system could be when tested. But beyond accountability, something even more significant had been restored. In the end, it wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, about trust, about the invisible lines that hold an institution together. Princess Anne didn't just uncover the truth, she protected something far greater. But as the dust settled, one question lingered in the quiet halls of the palace. What had this victory truly cost? Because while the audit had delivered clarity, and while the conclusions had restored a sense of order, the deeper impact could not be measured in numbers or reports. It could only be felt in the subtle shifts that followed the quiet recalibration of relationships, the unspoken awareness that something fundamental had changed. Reports suggest that the restoration of financial integrity tied to Zara Tyndall's legacy was seen internally as a necessary correction, a return to the principles that had originally guided those provisions. But restoration is never as simple as returning to what once was. Because once a system has been tested, once its vulnerabilities have been exposed, it cannot return to innocence. It moves forward, altered, more cautious, more aware of what can go wrong. Various interpretations of the aftermath describe a strengthening of Anne's role within the institution, not as a shift in title or position, but as a shift in perception. She was no longer simply a guardian of tradition, she had become a symbol of enforcement, of accountability, of the idea that even the most established structures must be defended when challenged. Insiders whisper that her actions during the audit have reshaped how authority is understood within the palace, reinforcing the belief that duty must remain above personal alignment. And yet, that reinforcement came with its own consequences. Because when accountability is asserted at that level, it inevitably creates distance between individuals, between factions, between those who see it as necessary and those who feel its impact more personally. It is now whispered in the highest circles that tension, though unspoken, continues to linger among senior members. Not openly acknowledged, not formally addressed, but present in the careful way interactions are managed, in the measured tone of conversations that once flowed more freely. Those familiar with the dynamics suggest that trust, once assumed, is now something that must be actively maintained. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, represents one of the most significant outcomes of the entire situation. Because trust is not just a feeling within an institution like this, it is a function. It determines how decisions are made, how responsibilities are shared, how power is exercised. And when that function is disrupted, even temporarily, it leaves a lasting imprint. The broader implications for internal governance are equally profound. Reports suggest that the changes introduced in response to the audit are not temporary safeguards, but part of a longer-term adjustment in how oversight is conducted. More layers, more verification, more awareness of how easily systems can be tested when assumptions go unchallenged. Those familiar with these developments describe them as quiet but permanent changes that will not be publicly announced, but will shape the way the institution operates moving forward. And within those changes lies a deeper realization. That power within the monarchy is not static. It evolves, it adapts, and sometimes it is redefined by moments of crisis rather than moments of celebration. Yet perhaps the most enduring impact is not structural, but emotional. Because beneath the protocols, beneath the audits and the decisions, there are individuals each navigating the consequences in their own way, some strengthened, some unsettled, all aware that what has taken place cannot be undone. The contrast between success and strain, between resolution and residual tension, becomes part of the institution's ongoing story. And as that story continues, it carries with it the memory of this moment, a reminder that even within the most carefully constructed systems, vulnerability exists. And when it is exposed, the response defines not just the outcome, but the future. Because in the monarchy, victories are rarely clean, and the echoes of this one are far from over. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.